All right, good morning, and welcome to What is Wild, today's EPN Breakfast program exploring leading-edge habituation strategies in the practice of wildlife conservation. My name is Eric Toman. I'm the interim director of Ohio State School of Environment and Natural Resources. Good morning also to the many environmental professionals from across Ohio and the Midwest who are currently with us virtually through the EPN YouTube channel. We are experiencing animals in our daily lives, the Canada goose, white-tailed deer, our pets, who are habituating and adapting daily to human behaviors and patterns. In an increasingly crowded world for humans and animals, we are all making adjustments. Two of our planet's most iconic carnivore species, the cheetah and African wild dog, also known as the painted dog, which are currently threatened and endangered respectively, are also adapting. Today's event is a fascinating one as we explore the scientific and conservation feats achievable through an intentional use of prior animal training practices and habituation. Two experts working on shared strategies to enhance the genetic diversity, safety, and quality of life for cheetah and wild dog in two very different locations are with us today. Andrew Ray, joining us virtually from Madikwe Game Reserve in South Africa, and Dan Beetem, here in the house, who will be speaking on his experiences on the restored grasslands of the wilds about 80 miles to our east. I will share emerging wildlife conservation findings observed in two very different landscapes. Chief Kendra Wecker from the Ohio Division of Wildlife will then relate and expand upon these themes here in the Buckeye State, including her team's use of canines for management. Brief professional bios of today's speakers are in your program brochure. To be mindful of our material waste output, we printed enough brochures for you to share together at your tables, and a digital brochure that you can reference on your own devices throughout the morning. Taking a picture using the QR code on your table will bring up a digital brochure on your mobile device. For those on YouTube, Molly Bean is placing a link to the brochure in the chat. Please feel free to utilize the chat function in YouTube to post your comments, thoughts, and questions throughout this morning's program. Our team will be reviewing those questions and will also take questions from the in-person audience after 9:10 a.m. this morning. Our EPN live stream is a free service of the School of Environment and Natural Resources, though we do seek out sponsorships to help absorb this cost and to ensure that students can register for all of our programs and events across the entire academic year for no more than $5. We received support today from a variety of sponsors, including the Sustainability Institute at Ohio State, as well as the Office of Sustainability and Strategic Services. Individuals who chose to sponsor a student during registration are listed at the back of the program brochure and are wearing a name tag with a red circle. Many thanks to those individuals and organizations for their contributions. Please review the agenda featured in your program brochure to see the order of this morning's presentations. Andrew Ray, who is in South Africa today, will share remarks and then join us for our audience question and answer session. Dan will follow Andrew, and Kendra will follow Dan. We would not be hosting today's program without the hard work and commitment from Ohio State's Center for Human-Animal Interactions, Research and Education, also known as CHAIR, and specifically its program coordinator, Madeline Winans. Madeline is a two-time Buckeye alum, graduating from Ohio State first with a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology in 2019, and also recently completing a Master's of Science in the Department of Animal Sciences. Madeline has professional experiences working with zoological institutions in areas of animal care and welfare, education, and research and outreach. Her graduate research evaluated the effect of transport and relocation on the welfare of the California sea lions at the Columbus Zoo and Aquarium. Madeline has been involved with CHAIR in various ways since its inception. She has worked with the EPN for nearly 10 months developing this program today, and will offer some introductory comments as we begin. Madeline, thank you for your support and lead up to today, and please come up and tell us more about what is wild. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. And hello, everyone. As Eric said, my name is Madeline Winans, and I am the program coordinator for the Center for Human-Animal Interactions, Research and Education, which we call CHAIR. For those of you unfamiliar with CHAIR, we strive to enhance the relationships between humans and animals, and to do this through conducting collaborative research, education, and outreach. And we try to do this in each of our focus areas, which are companionship and zoea, which is the human health benefit of interacting with animals, welfare and behavior, and conservation. We are thrilled that you all have joined us for today's event, both those of you here in person and those of you on the live stream. This is our second time co-hosting an event with the EPN. Some of you may have joined us back in February for our program on human-carnivore coexistence, and we were very excited to partner with the EPN again. The idea for today's program, the topic for today's program, What is Wild?, began earlier this year when I traveled to South Africa with Chair's former co-director, Dr. Kelly George, who's here this morning. And on that trip, we were led by one of our speakers today, Andrew Ray, who you'll hear from. And we had the opportunity to engage with folks working in the Madikwe Game Reserve on fascinating strategies for managing the remaining populations of these two very charismatic species, the cheetah and the African wild dogs, and managing those populations across southern Africa. After having a chance to observe some of these practices, which you will hear about more from Andrew, we reached back out to our friends in the EPN to begin formulating the idea for an event that would allow us to bring together experts in this area and to have a discussion of some of the ways that we manage these animals across different types of settings. For example, I think many people, and formerly myself included, picture places where these megafauna live still as these truly wild places, these places that are completely untouched by human presence or human intervention. However, in an increasingly developed world, we find this is often not actually the case, as I'm sure many of you have experienced in your work in this area. Most often, there is at least some level of human-animal interactions occurring in these spaces, whether it's the coexistence of people with their local wildlife or a more intensive form of interaction, like some of the management strategies that you'll hear about today. And one of the things that struck us the most about observing these strategies in Madikwe Game Reserve was actually how similar they are to some of the practices that we use in zoological institutions, particularly here in the United States. And so our goal today is to try and highlight some of these similarities, and certainly some of the differences, in how we interact with these two charismatic species in intensive and more extensive systems, as well as how those ideas are relevant to how we manage our local wildlife right here in Ohio. As one brief example of the work being done in this area, Chair member Dr. Mark Flint and his graduate student, Brenna Brosh, who is also here today, are working on a project in collaboration with one of Chair's longtime external partners, the Wilds. This project is aimed at better understanding the behavior of the African wild dog pack at the Wilds, and using artificial intelligence to better understand that behavior. And the hope is that those findings can inform strategies for managing that species really across settings, potentially even including those in the wild. And so as we begin today's program, I encourage you to consider how you think about what the wild is. Are there places left in the world that you still consider to be these truly wild places, and what that looks like? And as we move through our discussion today, I would ask that you consider how those ideas are maybe confirmed or even challenged by some of the information that's presented by our speakers. And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our first invited speaker for today's program, Andrew Ray. As I said, I had the pleasure of traveling with Andrew earlier this year, and not only is he incredibly knowledgeable about these topics, but he's also tremendously passionate about and dedicated to the field of wildlife conservation. And so we hope that you enjoy this presentation.
My name's Andrew Ray. I'm a private safari guide with my own safari brand, Ray Safaris. And we've recently started a small little non-profit called Worthwhile Africa, which focuses on donor-funded equipment to existing wildlife management and research projects across the African space. So I've been asked to just chat a little bit about the issues surrounding what is wild from an African field perspective. The challenges that are facing some of these species, and we're looking obviously specifically at African wild dog or painted dog and cheetah. I think primarily the biggest nature problem or challenge facing continental Africa, and this is not unique to Africa by any means, is that the the wildlife habitat that it is in Africa is being fragmented all the time. We have a growing population, human population in Africa, and there's an enormous need for arable land for crops and livestock, and for space for humanity to expand. And this leads to the fragmenting of wildlife spaces. And this fragmenting is happening quite quickly. And this becomes quite a unique problem, because you're dealing with species that require space. Game reserves are quite common in places like South Africa and Botswana and Namibia and Zimbabwe. Fenced off blocks of farmland, if you will, that is set aside for wildlife. But these remain just chunks of a greater puzzle, and one has to manage them and understand the management complexities of the wildlife that are in that space. And so this becomes a problem and a challenge in terms of understanding what a pack of wild dog or several packs of wild dog would do in a specific finite space, and how they would in turn interact with other creatures in that space, primarily apex carnivores like lion and spotted hyena. All the other wild dogs in Africa, and there's about 6,600 left in the wild in total, are in these fragmented habitats. Some of them in formally protected areas, and some of them living in kind of wildlife and rural man habitat, let's call it that. And this leads us to this problem. We have these three populations we're looking at, and we have these fragmented populations elsewhere. And we're busy learning as we go about the management of the populations, particularly in these fragmented habitats. And that's what we're going to talk about in some more detail shortly. And so the Meta Population Project was born. And what this is basically several separate packs of wild dogs on private reserves and some provincial reserves around South Africa, all separate, managed by various researchers and wildlife managers as a collective population. And so the researcher and the wildlife manager becomes the dispersal mechanism for when wild dog packs expand or breakaway pairs form, and they manage it as a population together, but geographically separately, if that makes any sense. And one of the reserves, one of the primary reserves that are part of this puzzle piece, this puzzle landscape of metapopulation wild dog reserves, is Madikwe. And Madikwe, it's a provincial game reserve in the northwest of South Africa, right up against the border with Botswana, and has several private lodges and has all of the notable big game in South Africa, all of the major carnivores. Madikwe has got 2 packs of wild dog, free-ranging. The females, the alpha females of each pack are radio collared. They're wearing collars that have telemetry equipment on them and GPS tracking equipment. And the reason for this is that they need to be monitored as an endangered species within that space. One needs to find them if there's any research work or veterinary work that needs to be done on them. And it also acts as a way for researchers and managers to monitor where the dogs are. And then, of course, inoculations against distemper and rabies are carried out, and that requires a veterinarian who has to then find the dogs and do the necessary. Radio collars require battery replacements or upgrades, and these have to be fitted, and a veterinarian is required for that process as well. So for a range of reasons, it's good to have them collared that they can be monitored. And so our colleague, Craig Catton at the Madikwe Wildlife Foundation, who our nonprofit supports quite a bit, has come up with this really intriguing concept of what he calls habituation feeds. And this requires a carcass. So he goes out and shoots an impala, an antelope in the area that's quite abundant, wild dog's favorite food. And he puts it in the back of his his vehicle, and his vehicle is a recognizable vehicle to these wild dogs. And he basically drives to the base of the hill country where the dogs are known to be because of the radio collar showing them where they are. And Craig then opens the back of his vehicle, pulls the dead impala onto the ground, and then stands there and he does a really specific whistle, which is quite unique. And the wild dogs respond to this almost immediately. They come off the hill. These are wild, free-ranging carnivores. And the entire pack comes off the hill in a space of a few minutes, and within a few minutes starts to feed close to the vehicle on this impala that Craig has given them. And while they're busy feeding, he can then turn around to Dr. Gerardus, the veterinarian, and say, okay, that second one on the left there is the one that we're targeting. And Gerardus can safely dart the animal and the work can proceed. And this is fascinating. I mean, it's a learned behavior concept that Craig has instilled to get these animals to be where he needs them to be for a specific function. And after that, you leave them be to feed on the carcass, and 1 or 2 days later, they're hunting their own food again. Is in focusing and looking after these dogs and managing them is this concept of bonding them. And this is quite interesting. The wild dog bonding of captive raised or captive bred dogs with their wild counterparts has proven to be incredibly successful. And this has been true in a range of these smaller reserves, Madikwe being one of them. So the scenario would be if let's say wild dog pups were found on a farm somewhere, and the adult dogs had been killed by the farmer, poisoned or shot, or whatever the case may be, and the pups were then recovered and were raised in a captive setting. There would come a time where you could take elements of that little group of pups and put them into an enclosure with a free-ranging pack of wild dogs, and in that enclosure allow the captive raised dogs to bond with the wild pack. And this takes a while, but it can be done within an enclosed space. And then upon release, they move out and together as a structured pack unit. And very quickly, the free-ranging dogs essentially school these new animals that were captive raised on elements of hunting and lion and hyena avoidance and the things that they need to survive. And very quickly, these so-called captive raised animals understand, comprehend, and start to behave like their wild pack mates. And before too long, they are behaving exactly as they should. And so the rewilding of that species is incredibly successful in terms of this bonding scenario. And that allows these researchers at these different reserves in the metapopulation to then disperse animals from the packs that they're monitoring and bond them with other dispersed dogs from other reserves to create new packs and to continue varying the gene pool. And so from that perspective, the wild dog scenario is quite successful. And there's a lot of scope in terms of getting them into the wild from a captive scenario and letting them flourish. Not so with cheetah. The trick is monitoring cheetah and doing with cheetah what we've proposed and are doing with something like painted dog or wild dog. In the sense that these are not animals that easily bond with others in a captive setting, unless you can try and bring a couple of coalitions of males together in the hope that they would bond. But coalition bonding tends to be on the basis of the animals being related to one another. So bonding within captivity is difficult. And there's none of this combined schooling that you get from in the wild dog scenario in cheetah. And so you can't expect to put captive bred or captive raised cheetah in with wild ones and expect there to be this interesting transfer of behavior and activity for their survival. And so this becomes quite tricky to the point that no rewilding of cheetah has ever been successful in the African wild space. And one of the interesting things, my colleague Craig, who we mentioned earlier in regards to the wild dog, is now having a look at almost writing the handbook on a couple of new and out-the-box ideas on what rewilding of the species might look like. In Madikwe, they have a free-ranging female cheetah who has quite recently had cubs, and she has a radio collar, and then there's a coalition of 2 males. And those are free-ranging. But they also have some cheetah in an enclosure. I think it's another coalition. And what Craig is trying to do, these are cheetah that have come from a captive scenario, and they're wanting to rewild them into Madikwe. But these cheetah have no idea what a lion or a hyena is or represents, and have not chased their food in any kind of, or caught food in any kind of open range scenario. So what's being done in this enclosure is that they're trying to show a cheetah what behavior they should be embracing, in the hopes that it would trigger some kind of evolutionary memory, muscle memory, genetic memory, that would allow it to behave in a way that helps it survive. So Craig or one of the other management staff there will arrive on the edge of the enclosure with in a pickup with an impala, a poor old impala on the back, having been harvested for this purpose. And he calls them with a kind of a whistle and a specific noises. They come to the edge of that large enclosure, to the fence, and he then drives around the enclosure on the outside very fast. And they understand there's food in the offing, so they start chasing or following the vehicle. And he goes as quickly as he can. And what he's trying to instill in them is this concept of chasing before you eat. So there's this concept of an order of, right, chase, run, and then there's a reward on the back end of that. And so eventually, after a bit of physical activity, he then gets into the enclosure quite quickly, and he drops this carcass off at these animals and backs away. And these animals feed immediately. And the behavior is quite interesting. They're already, in a very short space of time, we're behaving in the way that wild cheetah do around a carcass. One will feed, and the other will look out for any potential approaching danger, hyena or whatever that may be. And so there's one on the lookout and there's one feeding, and then they swap places. Craig gives them a short time for feeding, and then he takes the carcass away, which happens often with cheetah. They are frequently robbed of their kills by bigger scavenging carnivores. He has this life-sized cardboard cutout of a lion on a wheelbarrow. And so he charges at these cheetah, pushing this wheelbarrow with the sounds of lion in the background, growling and snarling and whatnot, and chases them off the kill. And the visual thing that they're getting is this approaching large snarling cat that is moving them off their kill. And they dash away into the bush. Craig then takes what's left of the carcass away from them and places it just outside the fenced enclosure. And the idea there is that night you'll get hyenas arriving to feed on what's left of that carcass. And it introduces hyenas as a danger concept to these cheetah at night, but in a way that doesn't harm the cheetah because there's a fence protecting them. And so this is new kind of cutting edge behavioral adaptation or behavioral work being done to try and see if there's a way that humankind, those of us that are monitoring and protecting these creatures, can perhaps assist in rewilding some of these captive bred or captive raised creatures. Until now, cheetah not successful. So I hope that's given some insight. We've got these creatures in these more and more fragmented habitats, and that's continuing across the continent as we speak here. And we're trying to understand the concepts of limited space and how that impacts on the management of some of these creatures, particularly creatures that are not apex carnivores, that are not dominant in terms of that space and are in themselves endangered, and how that looks and how that operates. And I'm hoping that this little chat has given some insight into what that looks like in the African space, particularly in the game reserve and nature conservation space. I hope that's been of use to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. Thank you very much.
I tell you what, that was fascinating, and I could take this talk in an entirely different direction at this point based on some of the things that Andrew said. I don't have the slides for that. I am Director of Animal Management out at the Wilds. I'm not used to having a virtual audience, but for the people in the room, how many people here have been to the Wilds? That's everybody. What am I talking here about? That's fantastic. You know, we are, it's incredible that we have this amazing conservation center just 90 minutes from here in just outside of Cumberland, Ohio. It's an amazing place for a lot of different reasons, and I'm going to try to, I've been asked to kind of talk about some of the things that you don't typically see when you come out to visit the wilds. I always like to remind people of the history. This is what the wilds used to look like. It's reclaimed mine land. It's you know, the most common description I would get from people is it looked like the surface of the moon. The wilds is nearly 10,000 acres of this reclaimed land. There were some really visionary people as the reclamation work was ending who wanted to create a conservation center to teach people about the conservation of land and wildlife on this reclaimed property. And that's how it came to be the wilds. It was originally incorporated as the International Center for the Preservation of Wild Animals. Obviously, there were no marketing people involved in that decision. I mean, I still want to see that on a t-shirt sometime. In 1984, and then the design work and everything else kind of came together, and it opened to the public in 1994. The original concept was this was going to be a collaboration of all the different regional zoos to provide them space for their animals, you know, place to grow hay, things like that. This is what the land looks like today, beautiful rolling hills. Time and money and distance and things fall away. We are now a member of the Columbus Zoo family of parks. We operate under the umbrella of the Columbus Zoo. We are an accredited member of the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums. That's about 250 institutions across the United States. About 1,200 acres of the property is managed for our animal programs, what I do, the zoo side of the world. The rest of it is all being managed and we support research and all kinds of ecology work and the recovery of the land after the mining. There's just a variety of different projects that go on outside of my fences. About 500 specimens of 27 different species out there that we work with. And most of these species are part of a collaborative breeding program, like the AZA Species Survival Plan. And you know what? It's meta-population management. It's discrete populations, and we move animals back and forth. What Andrew was talking about with managing the dogs is exactly what we do in the zoos. And that kind of concept and strategy is what we're trying to do. And one of the things, when we talk to people, I challenge you to find wildlife out there that's not impacted by humans in some shape or form, and is not being managed in some shape or form. And that's what we're about, and that's what we like to talk to people about and explain. Recent assessments by International Union for the Conservation of Nature, about 28% of the species assessed are threatened with extinction. And just the kind of things that Andrew was talking about, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, conflict with domestic livestock, other human-wildlife conflict, all of these things are going on. What we do, besides providing an exciting experience for people to come out and see and learn about animals, the conservation breeding programs that we're involved in are creating these assurance populations to make sure that these animals survive, at least in human care in some shape or form, so that they're there when they're needed for future conservation efforts. At the same time, these animals are available to us to better understand them, to do research work, to figure out how we can mitigate some of those risks that the wild populations are facing. Now, because we have this beautiful wide open landscape at the wilds, it makes sense that our programs are largely focused on ungulates, animals that take advantage of that. And when you talk about what is wild, that's about the wildest thing we have. These are Bactrian deer. It's a Central Asian relative of the elk. These animals do not do well in a traditional zoo setting. This herd lives out at about 130 acres. We have a multi-male, multi-female pack. We actually are going into rut right now. These deer get to live about as close to the life of a wild deer as possible. And we manage them with just really minimal interaction. We'll go in and we'll have interventions if an animal needs veterinary care for some reason. We do that out in the field. We don't bring them into the barns, into the hospital, the clinic. We do everything out there with just minimal contact. Now, that's not to say that they're not being trained. And again, just Andrew's talk, when the food truck rolls out in the winter, these deer know that, right? And they come to that truck. So the veterinarians take advantage of that and ride out in the feed truck where they can get close to the animals. And then the animals learn, if the veterinarian's riding along, they'll be on the backside of the lake where we can't get to them, right? They learn, they respond to the stimulus in their environment. At the same time, it amazes me, our tour vehicles go through, and the deer, there's no really positive or negative associated with that. I've been in a vehicle driving right through the middle of a herd of 75 deer resting on the ground. Tour bus goes right through the center of it with a bunch of kids on board, and the deer don't even notice it. So they understand positive and negative stimulus, and they respond to it in their environment. We're affecting their behavior, and they learn. And so, even the wildest animal we have is trained in some way, shape, or form. Now, we do have species that require a lot more intervention and a lot more handling. And when we do that, when we have to have that kind of intervention and work with those animals, we want to make sure we do it, one, that it's safe for us and the animals, and two, that we really reduce the stress on it. So some are simple husbandry behaviors. It's knowing that when I open this door, I'm expecting you to go through to the other side without having to go in and force or pressure an animal to do that. And then we move on to some really interesting, when we have needs for the veterinarians to work with them, we can actually work with those animals and get them to participate in their care. When I want to move a rhino to another zoo, he has to travel in a big transport crate. Well, weeks before we want to move him, we set up that crate, we train him to go in there, we feed him in there, we make it a positive association, so when the day comes to close the door and put him on the truck, it's as less stressful as it can be for the animal. So this doesn't happen overnight. When the veterinarian says, I want an x-ray of that giraffe's head, you just don't run down to the barn and do it, right? It takes a while to do this. And it starts with having that positive association with the people that take care of them, right? They want to be near the keeper. That's a good thing. You see the giraffe touching its nose to that pool float? Target behavior. It's a very simple thing. Train the animal that a positive food reinforcement comes if it comes up and touches its nose to that. And then it's a stepwise progression to getting the animal in that position. And then we have to make changes in the facility sometimes to give us the safe access to those animals. You can kind of see there's some fire hose straps at the door there that keeps the giraffe from walking right in with the keepers. And then you have to get the giraffe, who are incredibly visual, and we have to get them used to seeing something new like this bright yellow x-ray box. All of these things, it takes a little step at a time as you make these approximations toward the final behavior, and you get a giraffe to stand still so you can take an x-ray without doing anesthesia. And that's an amazing thing, and it really is a huge change in the risk of having to immobilize, to anesthetize an animal to be able to do the work you want to do with it. We don't do this by ourselves. We work and we keep records, we talk to people, we network with other zoos. The Columbus Zoo has been great helping us with that. And then we also retain actually a consultant that comes out and helps us set our goals and evaluate our plans to make sure we're getting where we want to be with these different behaviors. And that brings us back to the carnivores. So this is the Wild's Mid-Sized Carnivore Conservation Center. Again, no marketing people involved in this decision. This is about 30 acres. This is actually why I work at the Wilds. 15 years ago, I came out on a job interview and was at the top of the hill there looking at this open land that nothing had been built yet, and heard this vision for this big area for these carnivores. It's like I went home and I said, I want to be part of that. I want to see that happen. As this was being developed, they reached out to the zoo world and said, we want to do something different. We want to move into some different species, and carnivores make sense. Kind of mid-sized carnivores make sense because, in terms of the structure, lions and tigers require a lot of investment. And what we heard was that cheetahs and painted dogs in particular, those breeding programs needed space. Cheetahs need space because to effectively breed them, we need the space for them to have their own individual space and the facilities to move them back and forth and play this dating game that we do to kind of accommodate the mate choice behaviors in cheetahs. Painted dogs they're so prolific. It's not, we've had litters of up to 16 pups. And so when your population grows that fast, you need to have space for that because we not only want packs, we want multi-generational packs where the pups get a chance to learn and be around other animals. The dhole, the Asiatic wild dog there, frankly, it was a population very, very small and wanted to offer it some space to see if we could get that program to grow and give it a chance to be a successful program as well. So, for better or for worse, cheetahs need a lot of intensive management. And one of the first things the veterinarians want to do is to be able to, one, give medications or vaccinate animals, and two, be able to draw blood for diagnostic tests. And again, when an animal's under anesthesia on the table, you can do just about anything you want to do with it. But you don't want to do that all the time. We have to figure out how do we do that? How do we get safe access to those animals so that we reduce the need for the anesthesia or coming out with a dart gun to give an injection by dart. And so what that means is we want to get the cheetah in a position that we can work with it. And then if you can see there, what we have is sideboard. It's a simple kind of L-shaped plywood stanchion that we set next to the fence, and we train the cheetah to come into that space between the board and the fence where it's parallel with the fence and we can reach through and have easy access to the animal. And we do that with food. It's the best motivator we have as we train animals. And so you start by putting the thing there, let the cat see it, you put it in the yard with the cat, let the cat smell it, you start, you feed them approximately, you start to graduate, move the food in to the end of the chute, and getting used to be there. And you can see now with a person outside working with the cat, feeding it, giving it food rewards. For injections, you start by gradually, you kind of poke it a little bit. And you work your way up from just poking it and maybe a paper clip or the end of a syringe. And then gradually you're at the point where the cat is getting rewarded and the food reward overwhelms the annoyance of somebody poking them in the rear end. And you can give an injection. And that's great because you've been able to do that without chasing an animal and using a dart gun and a risk of other injuries. To draw blood, it requires a little more manipulation. We're lucky that cheetahs have and actually readily access a good vein in their tail where we can get a blood sample from. That means as they're eating, you start poking their tail and lifting their tail. And either they're positioned by a door or a gate where we can pull the tail underneath, or we create an access through the fence where we can access the tail. And the same thing, you work your way up to poking it and sticking it. And get to the point where the cheetah will tolerate being able to have a needle stuck in there and be able to draw blood. Now, I will tell you that we're blessed with great vet techs who don't have to spend a lot of time poking around to find that vein because they don't put up with a lot of it, but they will because they're getting that food reward. So that's great. It means that, if we have an animal that needs to go to another zoo and we need to do some pre-shipment testing, we don't have to anesthetize that animal to get those blood samples to do that. If we have an animal that's down and not looking right, we can get a blood sample and the vets can have a blood panel and get a better feel for what's going on with that cat without having to do an anesthesia and add that stress to it, right? So it also means that because we had a number of cats that were trained for this, we were asked and we were able to provide blood samples to help demonstrate the safety and efficacy of a COVID vaccine that was created for zoo animals. So over the course of a year, we did pre- and post-vaccination blood draws for these cats that were, samples that went into the study that helps us better protect all the cats out there in the zoo community. It's also not a big step from poking a tail to wrapping a blood pressure cuff around it. And to be able to have good data on the blood pressure of an awake, normal cat is something we really hadn't had an opportunity to do before. And when a cat's under anesthesia, we can monitor those kind of things, but the anesthesia drugs affect their blood pressure. And so training cats to have a blood pressure cuff on their tail and collecting that data also helps us build the data set, the database we have there for better understanding the health of cats as we start looking at other health problems with cats. So this training is very simple, very basic stuff, but gives us a lot of information to kind of help manage these animals and help take better care of them. Now, the Wilds is a designated breeding center, one of 10 breeding centers for cheetahs in the United States. So we spend a lot of time thinking about cheetahs and pregnant cheetahs. Cheetah gestation is about 93 days long. And, you know, when we want to know if a cat's pregnant, you know, there's typical things you can do, like taking hormone data and things like that. The problem is more than half of the cats go through a pseudo-pregnancy. After they're breeding, their body sets up, and for about 2 months of that gestation, it looks like they're pregnant. The hormones stay like they're pregnant. They actually put on weight, and it's kind of really difficult to tell. So we have to generally wait till after the 2 months of pregnancy to get a hormone profile that will confirm an animal's pregnant. So a radiograph, taking an x-ray of a cat, seems like a good option, right? Now, we only get a few days ahead of the hormone data to be able to visualize the cubs in there, but it's still going to be a really helpful thing. But how do you do that without using anesthesia? Well, first of all, we go back to the facility design. As we designed the carnivore center out there, we went all over the country to the places that had really good success and looked at their facilities and said, what works, what doesn't work, what do you like, what would you change? And will proudly announce that we stole these from the Fossil Rim Wildlife Center in Texas. These 2 side cages are attached to the building, and they're set up so the cats can enter the building through this space, and it's a space that's comfortable enough for a cat to sit and eat, and we feed them in there every day. So they're very comfortable, and they have a positive association with sitting in this small space, and it's not hard to shut the door behind them. And then they're right there where you need them, and you can do different things. We put a scale platform in there. They go sit and eat, and we get a weight on them when they're in there. We can easily transfer them to another crate, which is where we go with the x-rays. So what we did was we made a crate we could take x-rays through. It's tall and narrow because we want to keep the cat in a position that it's in a good position for doing the radiographs. It's made of plexiglass so that it's transparent to the x-rays. And then in order to keep the cat in the right position, we had to build this tall shelf there so they had to kind of stay upright and reach in to eat. Now, all of that, you know, you got to get the cat used to it. It's new, it's different. Actually, the version we have now, the front of it's shaded because the reflections on the front seem to bother the cats. Again, it just step by step to get them used to seeing the crate, put the food in the crate, eventually get the crate up there, and then you move in with all the equipment and the people in the funny looking gowns and the big yellow box and all those kinds of things you do. And as you'll notice, the cat is still busy eating, right? And so what we're doing is we're habituating them to these things and desensitizing them to all this difference to the point where we can take that picture. And hopefully you can see kind of on the bottom curve of the belly, you can see the spine and the skull of one of the cubs there. And you can visualize the cubs fairly early. It takes a little bit longer in gestation to be able to actually visualize and count individual cubs. And this becomes important because the average litter size is maybe 4 cubs. We've seen as many as 7 or 8 that moms have raised with no problem. It's the other end of the spectrum. It's the single cub we worry about, right? And it's thought that a single cub doesn't stimulate enough milk production from the mom. She doesn't get enough stimulation to be able to support a single cub. And if we look at this and see there's a single cub in there, we totally have to shift our plans, right? Now, the good thing is we're involved with this bigger breeding center coalition of 9 other breeding centers, and we know who's got pregnant females and cubs on the ground, and we know when litters are going to be born. If we have a singleton cub and there's another litter on the ground within a week or so age difference, you can take that cub to that other litter and slip it in. And we've not done this with the wilds, but our other partners have literally flown a single cub across country and slid it into the litter when the mom wasn't looking, and she raises that cub. And so then you have a cub that grows up being mother raised and has all those appropriate behaviors. And as Andrew was kind of talking about the captive bred cats, it at least grows up and has that behavior and experience to grow up to be a cheetah. Now, If we have to, we're capable of hand-raising that cat, and it's a whole different set of challenges. But having the forewarning gives us the chance to make those connections and make those things happen so we can provide the best possible future for that cat. Now, on the other side of the carnivore center, and I love this because Andrew was the same story, the dogs are an entirely different approach, right? We have the same facility. I have knocked the camera off. We have the same type of facility, and you see we have the feeding cage set up. The dogs, because they're social, we don't feed them individually. We feed them as a pack, okay? We want them to eat together because that feeding together, that bonding, is really crucial to keeping the pack together. We don't like to take a dog out of the pack. We're very careful, even when we take the dogs out of the pack for medical treatments. You know, when we remove them and try to get back to them, that's a lot of stress on the group. And so we do a lot of things to kind of mitigate that and getting the animal back into the pack again. So if we can do things to treat them individually, we'll do that rather than trying to do an anesthesia or remove a dog from the pack. So this is a dog being trained to come into the crate. So we wanted some to be able to do something different. Now they're not like cheetahs. They won't comfortably sit there and eat slowly, and the biting end is much closer to the back end. And for these reasons, we wanted to do something a little different. A couple of years ago, we had pups, 2 litters of pups born, 2 consecutive years. We got up to 18 dogs. And so we actually had to expand our holding, and we built a new building. And when we built the new building, we added this feature. It's a transfer chute between the 2 buildings, and it has a built-in squeeze restraint. So the dogs come through here. We can shut the doors on either side, pull that back panel up, and essentially limit the movement of the dog. And that allows us to go in and do injections. We've drawn blood from dogs this way once they're kind of habituated to it and used to the situation. So the challenge here isn't so much as with the cheetahs. The challenge is getting the dogs to have a positive association and routinely moving through this space so that you can use it when you need it. An entirely different species, an entirely different approach. But it allows us to do what we need to do with the animals with as less stress as possible and maintaining the pack structure. So again, we have to kind of make decisions based on what we're doing with each species and what's happening with it. So we've been talking carnivores. We do this with everything we work with. Our big challenge right now is we last year opened up a new program called the American Institute of Rhinoceros Science. It's a multi-institutional collaborative research program that's based at the Wilds, and it's looking at this really wide variety of things affecting rhino health and well-being. So just the other day, we had folks, had a rhino trained to stand in the chute, have electrodes attached to it to do bioimpedance fat measurement. And again, you can do that understanding the animals, understanding their behavior, and understanding how to have their trust to get them to participate in doing these kind of things. And it's like I say, this is the kind of things you don't see when you're visiting the wilds and just riding around and looking at animals. But we have lots of different ways that we're working with these species, lots of different ways that we're interacting with them. And again, it's all for maintaining these populations and better understanding them so we can further kind of the conservation efforts both at the wilds, at other zoos, and for the populations in the wild. So thank you.
Okay. Nice talk, Dan. I enjoyed that. So now we're going to switch to Ohio wildlife. We don't have the megafauna of rhinos and things like that in the wild here, which is probably a good thing. And but we have a variety of wildlife that does need a lot of attention and care. And I'll get through this here. Okay. So today I'm going to tie it up a little bit with how we train and use canines. Canines are dogs that are in law enforcement, and how they aid our interactions with the public. And then also I'm going to switch over to how technology aids us in wildlife and fisheries biology. And then I wanted to share also our mission statement in case you're not familiar with the Ohio Division of Wildlife. But we have the state agency responsible for our native wildlife here in the state, and our goal is always to have healthy, stable wildlife populations, and then, of course, all the recreation that goes along with that, and how people like to enjoy wildlife. So in the Division of Wildlife, we have a new canine program that started in 2018 with 5 dogs, Finn, May, Mattis, Scout, and Mila, or Mila, actually. And Finn is retired on the left-hand side, but I want to keep him in here because he was part of the original group of canines. And our canines undergo a rigorous 10-week program that is in line with the Ohio Peace Officer Training Academy for law enforcement canines. And the training does not end with their graduation. Our handlers and our canine officers complete 6 hours of training weekly to maintain their skills. And the canine teams must retest annually to maintain their certifications, and they have received advanced training in odor detection so that they are able to find wild animal parts and human odor from clothing articles. And they're a great group of dogs. The shepherds are particularly honed in on their handler and are very protective of the handler, and the labs are a little more friendly and can do public events easier for us, and will roll over and you can scratch their belly, but you don't want to touch those shepherds. They don't like that. So they're trained on the use of scent tubes, followed by an instant reward when the correct tube is indicated for the specific scent detection command that was given. And as the canines get more proficient with consistently detecting a scent it is asked to search for, the scents are hidden in a progressively tougher location. If the canine has trouble during the training, the handler and the trainer will go back to the basics and work the dog through the training issues until the canine is successful in completing the training task. The training methods are designed around the dog's natural instincts and behavioral drives, and again, they're trained on a variety of scents. But what do they do when they find the scent? Our canine, this one is Scout, and she has found a shotgun shell. You can see it here down the lower right-hand corner. And they are trained to sit down, not disturb the evidence, because that's really important about finding evidence, is how it's found and what's on it. And they sit down with their paws around the object that they find. If the canines are, if they find something that they can't get their paws around, which is quite frequently actually, then they are trained to circle it or stay in the vicinity until the handler can get to them. And in this particular image here, the dog on the left has a waterfowl on top of the boat, which it can't access. And then on the right is a breasted out turkey that's been thrown in the water, and the dog is circling that. So some other real-world examples of how we use these dogs. Canine May, she's on the left, poses with an illegally possessed fish fillets, which were seized as evidence in a criminal case. And quite frequently, the dogs are very helpful to us because, as we encounter poachers, they tend to lie. And they will stop lying when they see the dog come out, because the nose knows, and you can't lie to the nose. So it's really helpful to our officers in that situation. And let's see. And in the bottom right, Canine May located a weapon used in a felony assault. And then also Scout there again with a weapon used, which was a knife. So all kinds of things that they encounter out in the woods. And we frequently also assist local law enforcement agencies, particularly in the rural areas where there aren't very many officers. Sheriff's offices are understaffed, and we will go out as part of community policing and assist in other situations that are really not hunting related or fishing related, but as part of good community service and law enforcement, we do aid them in a variety of things. So the impact on conservation, they do a variety of things besides just wildlife. We also seek out and protect and regulate ginseng, which is a plant, a native plant in Ohio, highly commercially sought after and valuable, and people dig this plant up in search of the roots, and they trade this into the Asian and foreign markets generally. It's very expensive. So they, the dogs can seek out ginseng, and also, again, when people are lying or hiding it, the dogs can find it, and it's super, super helpful. They help us with compliance with all of our game regulations, and then, of course, tracking lost individuals out in the woods. So let's switch over to the biology side of things. I know we're short on time, so let's keep this rolling. And how we use technology also in wildlife. It's not necessarily to train wildlife, but really how it helps us in what we do. But mark and recapture studies are used to create mathematical models that estimate several wildlife parameters, including population estimates, survival and mortality rates, and dispersal movement ecology. Mark and recapture studies have come a long way. Technology has advanced over the years, and historically these studies have consisted of using bands, ear tags, and wing tags to track wildlife. But we use a variety of technologies, including net collars, here on a swan, telemetry units, and also here's one on a turkey for releasing and tracking. We also use VHF transmitters on northern bobwhite quail. These are battery-powered devices that send out pulses at specific frequencies. And for the northern bobwhite quail study, the small devices are placed around the bird's neck. And the biologist can then track wildlife movement patterns using a directional antenna and VHF receiver to pinpoint the movements. Different frequencies are used to identify different species, and we can track their location. Using this data, we can determine where the individuals are spending the majority of their time and in what kind of habitat. VHF transmitters are also used in our wild turkey studies, as are GPS transmitters. And GPS transmitters are similar to the VHF transmitters, but use satellites that orbit the Earth to detect movement patterns. A signal is sent to the satellite, and the direction and distance from the signal to the satellite is used to pinpoint the location. Oh, go back to one. That one was a picture of a hen turkey and her journey across how she traveled in a specific amount of time. So you can tell they move around quite a bit. GPS collars are also used in our bobcat studies. And here, with the color pattern of the blue, the green, and the red, are 3 individual cats, 1 female and 2 males. And this can be super important in tracking their interactions. And as you see, they don't like to interact very much. They've got very distinct home ranges. And this helps us understand more about the competition for habitat, hunting, breeding, and again, their home range, which in this map, I think you can see it, but the epicenter for the bobcat population right now is in Noble County. It's growing out. We've found bobcats in over 60 counties, so keep your eyes out for when there may be one coming near you. Sandhill cranes and satellite transmitters. Sandhill cranes were extirpated in Ohio for over 50 years and began breeding again in 1987. The map on the right shows the sandhill crane's migration patterns to wintering locations, and findings from the study suggest that most cranes migrated to Florida, Tennessee, while some remained in Ohio, about 28%. Migration depends on a variety of factors, including the severity of the weather, food, and habitat availability. Cerulean warblers, we use geolocators on them, and they use light levels to determine an animal's location, which can be determined by using the length of the day, the latitude, and the time of the solar noon longitude. Geolocator is attached to the bird with a very small loop harness, as you can see right there pinched in his fingers. So how are these birds trained with it? I don't know. They do adapt, they tolerate them, and it's super helpful for us tracking and gathering our data. So let's move on from terrestrial to some aquatic species and how we use telemetry and other tools with our fisheries research. Beginning in 2011, we joined a Great Lakes-wide effort to use acoustic telemetry. Any fish with an acoustic tag is detected anytime it swims near a receiver. And we have a series of receivers in Lake Erie, and I'll show you that here in a minute, so that as the fish swims by, there's a ping and a data point. We've had various projects over the past 11 years that have tagged walleye, which is the top right photo, smallmouth bass, lake trout, which are the other 2 photos, a lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, yellow perch, muskellunge, and grass carp. Results inform management and help us identify seasonal movements, spawning locations, interactions, and environmental variables, such as hypoxia and the harmful algal blooms. habitat use, and in the case of grass carp, their detections help inform removal efforts. So this is my video, and let's see if the video gremlins are going to attack me, but I'll try to start it here. Okay. Yeah. I'm hitting the button, but it doesn't want to go. Can you turn that on back there? Can you start that video? Okay, there we go. So this is an animation of tagged walleye, which migrate from 2016 to 2017. So this is 1 year progression. Each blue dot is a tagged walleye, and each black dot is a receiver location. And then the movement is interpolated between each known detection. So in 1 year, you can see how walleye go all the way to the east into the central basin and come back to the western basin. And they do this because the temperature and the daylight and the water's cooler on the east side, and obviously they're going to move. So I think that's a pretty cool video. We didn't know this until we could use technology, right? Oh, there it goes now. Okay. But, so why do this research, and what is the impact on conservation? And marking research helps us better understand species population status, which is important for supporting the expectations from the public. We use data-driven research to inform population management decisions, and this helps to meet the needs of our customers, which, you know, their goals are to stock animals or harvest bag limits and regulations. And we also monitor a number of diseases. You've heard a lot about diseases in the news lately with chronic wasting disease in deer, episodic hemorrhagic disease, also in deer, avian influenza, white nose syndrome. The list is quite long these days. So we are particularly interested in monitoring all wildlife, game species, and the species that we consider wildlife diversity, and we support the species of greatest conservation need in Ohio. We also want to make sure we have healthy, stable wildlife populations for people who like to enjoy wildlife, whether it's through bird watching, hunting, fishing, trapping, nature photography, and make sure that we have a lot of animals out there for people to enjoy. So in conclusion, I would like to invite you to the Wildlife Diversity Conference, which is March 1st here on Ohio State's campus at the Ohio Union. If you've never been to that, it's a really spectacular conference. About 1,000 attendees come every year to hear more about Ohio's wildlife, interesting stories and tales, and it's a really nice collaboration of people that enjoy wildlife and like to get together. So look for registration after January 10th, and come see us here at the Ohio Union March 1st. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have time for some questions, and I'm going to take the first question from the online audience. Nikita Rains asks, and this is a question for Dan, and welcome back, Andrew. The question for Dan is related to the wilds, and Nikita's question is, prior to the mining, the coal mining that was happening at the wilds property, is it known whether there was a community of people that inhabited the land, tribes?
I think this microphone works. That's actually a great question, and I want to plug this. Yes, absolutely. There's a coming soon. Doug Swift from Denison University is working with the 100 Days in Appalachia project and has done an amazing collection of historical information about the wilds itself. And so in the process of him coming out and interviewing people and talking about it, we learned a lot more about the families that were there on the farmlands before it was mined. But I also was amazed that after 15 years of working there, I had no idea there was actually 2 Indian mounds on the property. I apologize that I don't know the specific tribes and I don't know a lot about it, but I want to give a plug for Doug's website. It's going to be an interactive website. There's going to be a lot of really great combination of both written material and individual videos of interviews with people about the history of the wilds. So yeah, I myself am learning more about it as it goes. So keep an eye out for announcements about that for the Doug Swift's 100 Days in Appalachia project.
So I have a question, not a specific question to, or not a question to a specific speaker, but some of y'all brought up cats, and I'm not aware of how much work in veterinary virology y'all do. And I'm wondering if you have been able to observe anything related to the feline coronavirus and its mutation, FIP, in wild feline species.
Andrew?
Apologies, was that a question for me?
Well, I can jump in and say that certainly we are aware of that. We track and for the ones that we're able to, we vaccinate for those kind of things. We test for those kind of things in our populations. I cannot speak to prevalence in wild populations.
Yeah, sorry. Can I didn't hear the question quite clearly. Was that a reference to coronavirus in wild populations?
So my question is specific to cats or just feline species and the feline coronavirus as well as its mutation, FIP?
It's not been something that has been on the radar here in terms of management of wildlife. Certainly in captive populations like zoological gardens and the like, smaller safari parks and that kind of thing, where the management needs to be more intensive, and there's a more intensive veterinary input. Yes, that's been on the radar, and they've certainly been inoculating and doing the things necessary. But wild populations, no. The biggest concern in Africa that's been on my radar as a safari guide across the continent has been the transmissible scenario of COVID from people to primates. So they're quite aware of that in places like Uganda, where you trek with gorillas and chimpanzees and things, not to be able to transmit that. So yeah, that's my answer.
I jump in certainly from a conservation standpoint with the painted dogs. Diseases like rabies and distemper are actually really a problem, because the dogs typically range out of areas bigger than the protected areas and interact with domestic dogs. So some of the work, and even some of the work that the Columbus Zoo Conservation Grant Fund has funded, has been vaccination clinics for domestic dogs in communities surrounding areas where they're painted dogs, to provide protection for the painted dogs. They're naive to those infections, and because they're so intensely social, an infection in one dog can spread and wipe out an entire pack. So certainly control of those diseases in domestic animals can impact conservation of the wild dogs.
Apologies if I can just jump in there. That's quite right. I was referencing coronavirus or COVID particularly, but yeah, certainly in terms of things like distemper and rabies, these are enormous concerns, and vaccinations in some of the more remote and finite wildlife spaces are conducted on an annual basis. Distemper particularly. Distemper almost wiped out one of the largest populations in Africa a few years ago in southern Tanzania. So it's a very real scenario that wildlife management are focusing on. Yeah.
To the Ohio bobcats, I haven't heard of anything detected in our population.
So we have another online question from Anna Arbogast, who asks, have you seen impacts of wildlife conditioning practices in areas with high human-wildlife interaction? And are there issues with people who aren't wildlife managers taking advantage of conditioning?
Wow, that's quite an involved question. I think in the African wildlife space, there's less of that, because there's still quite a bit of space. We haven't reached those kinds of serious conditioning scenarios yet. I will, however, say that in places where there's a lot of tourism impact, particularly from the safari industry, on certain populations, that there is conditioning that takes place that can lead to problems down the line. If you're getting large apex carnivores or really big pachyderms like elephant and the like associating with the proximity of humankind, on days when that goes awry, you can have some pretty serious and problematic things happening. So I think in the safari space, certainly, and I would say conditioning with creatures that are moving around in rural areas where there is humanity, I think conditioning does take place. It's the nature of things. It's the nature of how these things work, and that does play a role, particularly around resources that are shared. So you've got rural people that are wanting to take their livestock to drink at a waterhole, and you've got a thirsty elephant or a thirsty lion or a thirsty cheetah or whatever the case may be, needing to share that same resource. So there's certainly challenges in that respect.
And jumping in from my side of the world, I was just actually looking at a project looking at an idea for developing a captive breeding program to augment a wild population. And one of the biggest discussions was, how do you manage those animals so that when they go back out to the wild, they're not conditioned to people and they have the proper avoidance response and things like that? How do you intensively manage them to breed, but then produce offspring that are ready to be wild animals again? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
If I could speak
Good question.
to that in Ohio, we do have human-wildlife conflict here with people trying to feed wildlife and augment things, feeding ducks in ponds, things like that. So it is problematic. It is probably one of our number one calls to our office, is how to help with wildlife, particularly in urban settings. And then we have to work with partners like the Ohio Wildlife Rehabilitators Association to see if some of the animals can be returned back to the wild or not. So it is very problematic, and again, it's best not to feed wildlife in an unnatural situation.
Okay, final question.
So my question, obviously this event centered around those mid-sized carnivores, the wild dog and the cheetah, but as far as intensive training practices for the future, I was wondering if any of you had any ideas for next steps or species you'd like to maybe focus on in the future.
I didn't hear that quite clearly, so I'd let one of my other colleagues that are there have a go first, if they wouldn't mind.
The question was ideas for other species or other plans for taking training into management like this into the future. I'll just do my side of things. Obviously, we deal with things as they come up. This new rhino project has created a need to get the animals habituated to doing kind of different types of assays, and we have rhinos who are walking around wearing Fitbits, essentially. Things like that. So for us, it comes up, and we typically annually kind of look at what we're doing and setting goals for our training programs. We occasionally have something that pops up where, like an individual animal, where we have a need to do something, whether it's crate training for shipment or something like that. I don't know if you've got ideas for your wild populations.
Yeah, I think that we're back to this concept of spatial separation and fragmentation, and I think one of the big keystone species that gets discussed and knocked about and is still a big enigma in South African conservation is elephant, and the fact that how do you manage these giant populations in ever decreasing bits of wildlife countryside? And there's a lot of work being done now looking at how one can try and work with wild elephant populations, understanding their movements between true wildlife countryside across areas where mankind has developed a presence, and allowing elephants to understand these concepts of barriers of fear and avoiding places where there might be conflict, and yet still getting them to move, that there's a spread of impact, and not just one place being impacted until it becomes a desert. So people are looking at that in terms of trying to get a wild population to understand how it should move, using things that elephants don't like hedgerows of chilies and beehives and things that they don't tend to embrace that much, and they allows them to avoid and get away from crops. So yeah, I'm getting off the topic from a carnivore perspective, but elephant would be a big one for Africa, and I think there's a lot of interesting discussion being looked at in terms of training them
as to how to move with space and to utilize space.
Thank you very much, Andrew, Dan, and Kendra, for your remarks and presentations today. If you could join me in thanking them for these remarks. And thank you all for your questions as well, and for the conversation we've been able to have. I was struck by, as we watched and participated in this, the similarities of challenges that exist in different places as we're thinking of different species with very different characteristics and patterns. And then also the ingenuity of managers to work with the species and work through these challenges and work individually with these species, with these different characteristics and needs that they might have. The mix of the technology as well as the engagement and care and just the approaches that are taken, it was very, very impressive and very informative, so thank you. As is our tradition here with EPN, we want to recognize each of you who've participated today with a certificate of appreciation. So we'll have those here for Dan and Kendra. And Andrew, don't worry, we'll have a carbon-free digital version on its way to you later today as well.
Thanks very much. It's been a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you.
And these certificates are to acknowledge your work to help us learn and to shape the world for the better. And we thank you so much. Madeline, I also wanted to share a framed certificate for you in appreciation of both your opening remarks and the hard work you've put into helping the EPN organize today's event. So thank you, Madeline. And we hope that you all enjoyed today's program. We do appreciate feedback that attendees like you provide during and following our events. For those currently on the YouTube live stream, please check out the program feedback survey that Molly Bean has just shared in the chat. For those here in the room, you'll receive a survey via email early next week. Please let us know your thoughts about the program topic, the food, and any aspects of the event. These help to shape and inform future events and activities. Please turn to the back of your brochure for details of our forthcoming EPN events. I'm very excited for this next program and our final event of 2022. On Monday, December 5th, join us on World Soil Day for a signature evening event that will celebrate internationally renowned experts in soil science and agriculture who will present alongside 2 nutrition and food policy professionals. The purpose of this session is to link together strategies for enhancing soil health and food production with the science of human nutrition and on how to make the healthiest food from the healthiest soil accessible to low-income consumers and producers. It will also review emerging collaborations within a community of farmers, scientists, engineers, farm service providers, and food companies committed to improving soil health and advancing agriculture's ability to become a solution to climate change. During the December 5th evening networking session, Ohio State graduating seniors will display community-based project work with regional partners including the Friends of the Lower Olentangy River, the City of Bexley, Tree Love in Wineland Park, Victoria's Secret, and the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, to name just a few. Save the date now for January 10th, which is Up in the Air, an EPN Breakfast feature that will bring together sustainability and aviation experts to disentangle the challenges and opportunities of carbon-neutral commercial flight. We will return to a wildlife conservation topic again on Valentine's Day, February 14th, because we love wildlife so much. This time looking at how a warming climate in Ohio is affecting the spread of vector-borne disease species, such as black-legged and Lone Star ticks, and subsequent management implications for both human and wildlife health. These programs, like all EPN programs, will be live streamed for free via our YouTube channel. For more details and to learn about all of our events, sign up to be an EPN member today. It is free, quick, and easy at epn.osu.edu. And while you are making your way out the door or clearing off your table today, please pay close attention to our zero waste signs and instructions posted above the waste receptacle bins to determine if your item belongs in the compost, recycle, or trash bin. Your actions will help us make this EPN Breakfast a zero waste event. And again, thank you all for joining us today.